Have you always known that you're on a soul path? And have you wondered how to gain real insight into the steps along your own unique journey? Welcome everyone, I'm Sarah Main, and thank you for joining me on Damayanti, the show for your soul. I'm so glad to have you along. Damayanti means peace and calm. Damayanti sheds a light for your soul through the wisdom that shines in the universal language of Sanskrit. Damayanti is the show that speaks to your soul, connects with your soul, and enriches your soul. Join me now on Damayanti, the show for your soul, and be inspired and uplifted by the beautiful light of this profound, timeless wisdom. Welcome everyone. Welcome to Damayanti, the show for your soul with me, Sarah Main. And today I have a very special guest. His name is Saad Khan. And Saad is a guy on his soul path. I'll let him tell his story. But along a soul path, when we walk it, we find we have questions. And Saad's got amazing questions, fascinating questions, incredibly intelligent, well-constructed questions, questions I would never formulate in that way. And I read them, I think, wow. And they even impressed my husband, and that's not easy to do. And so it seemed the best way was to have a Q&A live on the show, and Saad can ask me questions and I'll respond. And it's not that I have all the answers, but different people have a different response to these questions, and that just fills out your understanding. And as we go along our soul path, we discover that other people's questions are our questions, because these are often universal questions, although they may appear personal to the person at the time, but they are in fact universal. There are big issues, and it's wonderful that Saad's bringing them to the table in such a fabulous way. So welcome, Saad. It's great to have you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for inviting me.
So tell your story.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. I was just a little bit nervous, but
yeah, go ahead.
I was a video producer and wedding photographer for over 20 years. And the past 10 years, I got into, marketing, business transformation, and, I've been having a lot of fun with that. And I got over my mental health and addiction issues through a spiritual solution. And the questions that I have are based around, how can I change the way I talk about my solution? Because a lot of people are interested to know how I got over my mental health issues and my addiction. And the second I tell them that it was a spiritual solution, they want to run 100 miles. And I'm like, now, I'm trying to find a different way to talk about it, because one person, when I asked her, I said, why does that not interest you? And she said, oh, look, I'm just not interested in God and religion. And I said, oh, I don't think it was that. So yeah, basically my questions are based around that. How do I talk about, what happened to me without, scaring them off?
Yeah. But that is so beautifully, and thank you for raising the topic. I actually talked about it in a recent previous show, because you mentioned the word spiritual, just that simple English word, and it's an English word, it's perfectly valid, but to everyone it is so precisely different and filtered. And as you say, some people just roll their eyes, other people run 100 miles. Other people immediately, they have images of you on your knees in supplication. Some people you're off with the fairies, anti-science, whatever, brown rice, string singlets. was one thing my husband used to say, brown rice and string singlets. And that was obviously something he had. But it is a very... It's a good question, because it is one of those things that is not a comfortable thing to talk about. So the question is about how do you talk about it, this whole thing of spiritual, because you call it spiritual because that's how you're experiencing it within your own being.
Yes.
Other people will actually know what you're talking about, but they'll use a different word. And sometimes the very word spiritual shuts down the conversation unless you can tease out of them how they actually can connect with the same thing, just using a different word. How I was brought up, the word spiritual was just in the sort of literacy of day-to-day talk, but it was never meant as a sort of religious thing. And this is some decades ago, because the word spiritual did mean religious at that time. And there was very little understanding, general understanding, not like now, that it can be a much broader level of awareness. And I don't want to take words out of your mouth about how you explain and how you have connected and how you've come to use the word spiritual. But opening up the conversation, I have found, to the fact that, you know, we have our day-to-day level of experience, you know, everyday 3D level of experience. And then there's something more, there's something greater. There seems to be something beyond what we normally experience. And then, in a sense, stop talking at that point is what I've learned over many years of going through exactly the same discomfort of, oh God, how am I going to talk about this? Has been the way I have discovered is say a little bit and then stop talking and ask a question and open up the pathway and hold that space open to let the conversation develop that way. But the first thing is to actually put forward that there's something beyond the normal, beyond my normal inner triggers, my normal way of thinking, my normal emotional reactions to things, something beyond that, something greater, something more powerful. And it's tricky, you know, to talk about. Was how I started the conversation, and you specifically asked about how to talk about it. This is one way I have discovered is the best way, rather than feeling I needed to have the perfect sort of elevator pitch. And that probably says more about me than you, that I wanted to have the perfect answer years ago. And I've learned to just let the conversation develop. I mean, is this landing with you? Is this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's you know, definitely helped me understand how I can present and talk about it to people.
Yeah.
Look, obviously I've got a few more questions, but yeah, definitely it's a great start.
Yeah. And I've also learnt to use the word spiritual quite lightly, not use it as the central word and load it with too much of my own emotional meaning, as it were, because it is such a trigger word. And if the point in the end is, the aim in the end is to keep the space open so the conversation can proceed and the conversation can continue and stay open. And if the person's genuinely wanting to know, then I drop it in, but I use it in relation to other things, just to try and help keep it going. Because, you know, but I do clarify quite early on that I don't mean religious, because I certainly wasn't brought up with any formal religion or religiosity or any of that sort of thing. And so I've never associated spiritual with that, but other people do. So yeah, and I think also the more inner work that you do, my experience anyway, is the more inner work that you do and the more comfortable you are within your own self, then it gets easier to talk about it, because basically I'm not trying to convince anyone, I'm sure you're not, but also, you know, they can have their experiences and I've got mine, and I'm very comfortable now with where I'm at. And that's taken a long time for me to get to that point, that's for sure, but it's a process.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. And my next question would be, mindfulness also has that same attachment. You know, people want to run and, you know, they're just like, oh, no, no.
Yeah.
So, you know, my question would be, well, it's kind of two questions. I've replaced the word spiritual with connected, and I've replaced the word mindfulness with awareness and attention control exercises.
Yeah.
Would that be, you know, a good way of talking about it with people?
Yeah, for sure. And I hear you completely. The word mindfulness, like the word mindfulness didn't exist. Like I started on this sort of spiritual work when I, as you know, when I was young, like I was 10 years old. This is back in 1971. Okay, so this is the early 70s. That word did not exist, right? There wasn't in mindfulness industry, there wasn't any of that, right? So it sort of cropped up as an adult to me in the last few decades. And, you know, there's a whole industry around it, and it's fabulous. It's a shift in the consciousness. It's a genuine shift in the consciousness that it's even just part of everyday literacy. However, as you say, it's got baggage around it immediately. And so, you know, to navigate around that, and that probably tells you more about the nature of all of this, that anything anyone gets hooked onto gets baggage around it.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know, you could call it fried eggs, and trust me, you wouldn't be able to use the word fried eggs because people would say, oh, I don't want fried eggs, oh no. But look, let's carry this question over. We're going to stop for a break in a moment, and
Okay.
let's carry this question over, because these are big areas, and it's really good to get some conversation around it. So to help people, because the listeners are probably struggling exactly with this. How do I talk to my colleagues, my family, blah, blah, you know, and I mentioned spiritual, I mentioned mindfulness, and I think, oh God, they're gone, you know. But let's carry this over the break, because these are really fabulous questions. So we'll take a break and we'll be back. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to Damayanti, the show for your soul. And today we've got a special guest, Saad Khan. We're having a bit of a Q&A on the world of spirit and questions that Saad's particularly bringing to the table from his own journey. And they're fabulous questions. And I hope they're your questions too, because they certainly make me stop and think. And I really appreciate that. So welcome back, Saad. And let's get back into it. So your question was on mindfulness. Did you want to just throw that to me again? And let's keep going.
Yes, I wanted to talk about, like when I talk about mindfulness, I'm just asking if it's okay if I say, you know, attention control exercises, you know, or awareness exercises rather than mindfulness. And yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Well, firstly, there's no right or wrong to this, but and that's an obvious thing to say. But yes, because that's essentially with mindfulness, it's attention control. Now, the word control is another triggering word these days, because people don't like the concept of control. Neither do I. I mean, I'm sure you don't in certain areas, but then we know that in order to proceed, if you like, on our inner path, our path of inner development, and you're talking about this sort of spiritual approach, you need to actually get your attention focused in some way or another. Otherwise, we're just pinging off all over the place. And that's part of the problem and leads to the other issues. So attention control is exactly what it is, and that's a positive thing. It's a good thing. It's an area of discipline and strength that we need. And it's very much an integral part of mindfulness. So people go on weekend retreats, they pay a lot of money to do courses on this. And it's, you know, they'll do walking exercises practicing mindfulness, where they keep their mind with each footfall, rather than the mind pinging off and thinking about what they had for lunch yesterday, or what they've got to do tomorrow for work, or what their partner said to them 2 days ago that upset them. They'll just practice in a propitious setting with a group of like-minded people, and they'll pay a lot of money for this, to just leave a lot of worldly distractions of normal life and practice walking, because that's the exercise they've been given, a mindfulness exercise like that, where they're staying present as their foot hits the ground, right? And then they'll practice eating, like eating a raisin is one of a sort of a classic exercise, but they might be given something like a raisin to eat and just stay with the sense of taste and the experience at the time. And, you know, I mean, you could do that at home, but you need the support often to actually start getting a handle or getting some sense of control of your attention. And that is an intensely spiritual exercise. But, or a, a sort of, I don't know, quintessentially, not intense, it's a quintessential spiritual exercise. I mean, I've done it, part of those sorts of exercises formed a lot of what I was taught early on, you know, and that stands you in such good stead. But if you link that to spirituality, some people, as you say, they'll run a mile because of the filters and the triggers. And that says more about them and what they have to work through, rather than any issues of how you're explaining it. If it causes them to shut down, well, that's just work for them. But in terms of helping them, then finding sort of ways of navigating through that, and I say keeping the conversation open, it's an art form and it takes practice for sure. Does that help on the mindfulness thing?
Yes, it does. And actually, I was thinking of something else to ask you while you were speaking, and that is that the second problem I have is, as soon as they get a hint that it's the first part of my recovery was based around mindfulness. Yeah. They'll jump up and say, "Oh, but no, you don't understand. I've read Eckhart Tolle and I've done meditation," and and I'm like, yeah. Okay, but no. Yeah. That's the other thing, like, yeah. The people feel like they've already delved into that, so they're masters of that in that area, and they're trying to find something else to. Yeah, I don't know. What would you suggest? That I say in that situation? Yes. Ask a question is my thing. Without responding, say, and how did you find that? Or what impact does that have on your daily life right now? There's the whole thing of, I've read Eckhart Tolle and I've done meditation, and I nailed that onto the next thing, is absolutely, well, it's not a judgment, but it is absolutely indicative of the world that we live in now. It's like, as a teacher, and especially if you've taught young kids, when children at 5 years old start schooling, like formal proper schooling in 5, there are some children who, after about a week or 2 weeks, it can dawn on them that this thing of going to school, and there's such hype around it these days, that this thing is a little bit more long-term that obviously that they realized. Because some little 5-year-olds it's not everyone, but can go home to their parents and say, well, basically, I've done school now, what's next?
Okay. And
Yeah.
their parents have to kind of let them in on the secret that this is going to go on for a lot longer than they realize.
Yes.
You're like,
Yes.
you know, like the next 13, 12 years or something.
Yes.
And it's exactly the same sort of thing. Well, you know, I've done meditation, or I've done mindfulness, and that's fine, but it's an indication that their engagement is to a certain level. And that just means they're not prompted within themselves to take it any further.
Mm.
It may at some other point, and usually in my experience, some event in life or situation will bring things to a head. And to put it bluntly, the inner pain has got to get to a point where they've got no other way of avoiding it, and they will turn to that. And the blessing and the grace is that will be there for them because they've already done some work. And one thing, the Bhagavad Gita says this, and all the spiritual teachers of any note say this, that any effort you make on this, let's use the word spiritual, because that's something you and I are comfortable using.
Yes.
Any effort or work, no matter how slight it appears, no matter whether it's just one moment where you've redirected your attention into the present moment to what you're doing, or you have released some negative emotions or feelings, any inner work you do in any moment, no effort is ever lost. It may seem like it is, but it isn't. It's always there. And that is the beautiful thing. So if whatever work they've done, and then they say, well, I've done that, and they go on to something else, if in their life they come back to it, all of that will be there waiting for them, and they can refresh the approach and keep going. So that's the encouraging bit. But I always lead with a question, which is, you know, so what have you found? How have you found it? And then see if you can, depending on their response, then hear something in what they're saying, and your listening skills are crucial. And I was taught to listen with both ears. That's a phrase, listen with both ears. And then you hear something lights up in what they say, and then you can follow that. So you're really following them rather than giving them a lecture, as it were. I'm sure you don't lecture them, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you do this. But that's the way I would pursue it, to keep you notice there's a theme here, keep the conversation open. So throwing it back to them, asking them questions so they're engaged.
Do I have time for one more question? Or
yeah, sure, yeah, go.
So okay, the next question would be, you mentioned that the word mindfulness only came around the 70s. So would it be correct?
Later, actually.
Oh, later. Okay, so
Yeah.
I'll say, look, you know, the word mindfulness and all these mindfulness activities, say, you know, came around the 70s and 80s. So
Yeah.
would it be correct in me saying that, look, I understand that you've done these things before, but these attention control and mindfulness exercise have developed over the years. And so even though you may have tried it before, you know, they have developed, and we have kind of structured them in a way where they can make a difference. Would that sound?
Yeah. I mean, and that's factually true. I think there's a mindfulness, the beginning of mindfulness in the whole industry, that was sort of started in the 80s. Yeah, but it's definitely developed, and that's the nature of everyone working on it. The collective consciousness of people has risen, and it is more readily available. So someone who's engaging with mindfulness now, completely different from when it first started back in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, it's a much more evolved thing, and that's the nature of it. Everyone doing their bit, everyone practicing apparently on themselves, also contributes to the collective consciousness. So that you, for example, you're moving around in a field of consciousness now that is quite different from how it was when I was growing up in the 70s. doing essentially the same thing, probably a bit more structured, but the collective consciousness has shifted. And that ultimately is one of the things that's important about all of us engaging in this. If we are called and wake up, is we engage with this and we release that consciousness for everyone, whether they're aware of it or not. So it is actually an act of service. It may benefit us personally, but it's actually an act of service to the greater good. But anyway, you've asked such fabulous questions, and I might ask you back for another show because I feel we can keep talking. So we're going to end the show now, and I really appreciate you coming. And I like to finish with a little bit of Sanskrit. So if you just sit back and enjoy a little bit of the perfect prayer, I sing the Isha Upanishad, the invocation. That is perfect. This is perfect. From the perfect comes the perfect. And verily the perfect remains. May peace and peace and peace be everywhere. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you for spending time with me on Damayanti, the show for your soul. To find out more about Damayanti or to get my book, Conscious Confidence, Use the Wisdom of Sanskrit to Find Clarity and Success, or to purchase my range of beautiful spiritual jewelry, go to my website, damayanti.store. That's DAMAYANTI.store. Damayanti.store. See you next time.